Hey folks, so I think as painful as it is to do, we kind of need to talk about what's happening in the United States right now. We're in kind of a critical threshold, I would say, for the US and actually even for the world as a whole, because what happens here has enormous implications everywhere in terms of the planetary ecology, in terms of military, in terms of nuclear and artificial intelligence and so on. So I think we've kind of reached this threshold right now where people really need to take a bit of time and kind of appreciate the situation we're in and kind of what's at stake for us. And I'm going to try to do that in this video. Yeah, I mean maybe it leads to kind of thinking about our priorities individually. And yeah, so we're in a pretty extreme situation, and it's good to take some deep breaths, become mindful, become present, take stock of the situation, and maybe kind of like stop focusing on a lot of other things for a while, like maybe really make understanding this situation really like a priority. That's what I've been doing, and I didn't even like really want to do it. I'm sort of like in a way mesmerized. It's sort of like watching a car crash, but unfortunately you're also in the car while it's crashing, or like being on the deck of the Titanic as it kind of hits the iceberg and so on. So I've been sort of allowing myself to kind of just marinate in this or saturate myself with all the uncomfortable details and just like thinking through what's happening, maybe so you don't have to do all of that yourself. At the same time, I'm also scanning for any possible solutions, any ways like out of this pickle, this predicament that we're in. And of course, last week we saw these extraordinary speeches from Donald Trump and Pete Hegseth to the military. Hegseth said that they were sort of removing the rules of engagement, which basically means that they're, almost like suggesting that, these guys can commit war crimes if they want to. Trump said that he wants the military to think about using American cities as, training grounds for future foreign wars. And, this follows him saying that he wanted the military in Portland to use, quote unquote, full force, which means, the capacity to shoot to kill on peaceful, law-abiding citizens in Portland who, have a right to protest and peacefully and so on. And yeah, so this is like extremely dire circumstance. And I think we have to try to really, we're in a unique situation in the U.S. We've been the world leader. We've been this sort of hegemonic kind of empire, kind of had, since the Second World War, we had so much of the world's GDP and, the American myth of like progress and technological kind of evolution and sort of hyper-capitalism and so on. That's all like sort of happened here. And it feels like, I guess that's all kind of like unraveling or in a way, or like, it's hard when you're in the middle of a historical moment to really understand it. I'm sure people in, 1920s and 1930s Germany, wouldn't have been able to fathom all the reasons why the sort of fascism happened in the way that it did there. And it's hard for us to fathom because, yeah, we know that America is still a very wealthy country, and I think we're like 5% of the world's population, but we have been using like 40% of the resources and so on. And yes, there's a lot of things going on archetypally and mythically in a sense, as well as just in terms of economic and social terms and so on. And it's a lot to kind of like hold all these things at once to sort of get a multidimensional sort of coherent analysis. But I do think we need to come up with a kind of comprehensive understanding, that includes, not just socioeconomic aspects and the psychology of male grievance and so on, the narcissism and the sociopathy of the leadership class, but also understanding things like, how religion plays a role in this and gender relations and, the history of this country and so on. I mean, I admit that sometimes I feel like a sort of hamster in some kind of weird laboratory experiment, toggling back and forth. I have a sense sometimes that we really are just doomed, crushed at this point, but I also feel hope and wild strains of possibility at the same time. So yeah, all I feel that I can really do is kind of report on what's happening as honestly as possible, from my personal perspective, without really sugarcoating it, because I don't think we have much time left for that. And yeah, we really have to get more serious than we do. And I still see, unfortunately, like in the communities that I'm part of, mostly a lot of avoidance. People are like, I mean, they just had Climate Week last week, and a lot of people I know were there talking about, regenerative land projects, or they're going to do this, they're going to do that. But to me, it all just feels a little irrelevant when you have a, massive machine of the sort of corporate government hybrid that has resolutely posited itself as an ecologically destructive behemoth, and is actually sort of taking almost like cruel pleasure in getting rid of the renewable energy industry in the US, or taking away all the corporate regulations so that corporations can pollute. And I just read about one corporation that's just been allowed to drop like tons of radioactive waste in the rivers in New York, which will influence our kids getting cancers and so on. So I feel like, yeah, I have a lot of friends who are resolutely unpolitical and believe that the right versus left is all just ego tripping and the political system doesn't matter to them. But I think that that's also become a little bit of a bypass, because yeah, when everything is deregulated and you can't trust the food that you eat, and every financial system is corrupt, you're not looking at a very healthy future for your life or your child. And maybe you think you can escape because you have European citizenry, or you can go to Bali or something. But this second American Revolution that's happening here, this kind of insurrection and destruction of our democratic system, this is like, if they figure this out here, they're going to take this model everywhere. I mean, that's kind of the plan. And so it would be a better idea for us to figure out how to counteract it here, which may be admittedly very difficult at this point. So I may not get all the way there, but in a future videos, I will look at what I would say like the chinks in the armor of this kind of authoritarian machine, that this menacing authoritarian machine, and that includes kind of their kind of arrogance, their overreach, their crudity, their kind of like Aspergerish failure to understand like emotions and so on. I mean, people talk about the Trump and his cabinet being like a bunch of clowns, and it does have this sort of buffoonish quality. But that also apparently is what happened in fascist Germany. At first, people were like, "Oh, these guys are buffoons," and so on. And behind Trump and these people is a well-organized machine that's really planned for this for a long time. So that's like the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025, and yeah, it's kind of like the kind of building of the Confederacy in a way. So yeah, right now we're really sliding down. We're facing social decay, consciousness collapse, degeneration, and if we're not able to course correct, this could easily lead to concentration camps, mass imprisonments. Eventually, we might even see some kind of genocide or final solution here. And we shouldn't fool ourselves that that's not possible, because it's happened in many places around the world when people didn't even imagine that was possible. And some elements on the far right, are really already talking about this, implicitly. Sometimes they joke about it, or quite explicitly. For instance, Curtis Yarvin, who is, J.D. Vance quotes him a lot. Peter Thiel has supported him and so on. Yarvin has joked about turning the underclass into biodiesel, quote unquote, joked. Brian Kilmeade, I don't know how to pronounce his name actually, the Fox and Friends co-host, he recently joked that, or proposed that, it wasn't even joking actually, that maybe we should think about involuntary lethal injections, in other words, murder, for the 800,000 homeless people in the US. I just want to say that actually, I live in the middle of New York City, and homeless people can be annoying and aggressive and so on, but I actually really appreciate them. And, a lot of them had very hard lives, and, they had maybe had a lot of discrimination and sort of economic factors working against them. Maybe they were drug addicts or alcoholics or whatever, but a lot of them actually have a very, kind of encompassing understanding and way of being and a lot of insight. And it makes me very sad that we've reached a point in our discourse that, that these people like Comedy and Yarvin feel they have the right, even if they think it, to express such anti-human, uncompassionate kind of possibilities. And I really feel that if we're going to get out of this, we really have to. I mean, the social media and the internet really support kind of these destructive tendencies of wanting to push outrage to greater and greater volumes, to be more and more histrionic, to get likes or whatever. But we really need to get back to our innate feelings of kinship for others and our compassion for others, I would say. So yeah, I mean, Kilmiadi was later compelled to offer a lame apology, but he didn't actually lose his job as a result, as a lot of people lost their jobs recently over the whole Charlie Kirk thing. So like you have a black woman columnist or editorialist for the Washington Post, Karen Attiah, and she was fired because she made some comments, not even in an editorial, but on Blue Sky after Charlie Kirk's death. And among the comments that got her fired, she said, part of what keeps America so violent is the insistence that people perform care, empty goodness, and absolution for white men who espouse hatred and violence. That's a pretty reasonable comment. But yeah, it seems like we're living at a time when certain truths can no longer be spoken easily or without having potential consequences. And we're really seeing on the sort of Christian right, you have men who I've started to follow more and more, like Matt Walsh, who made that very popular film, What is a Woman? Jack Posobiec, author of the horrible book Unhumans, Nick Freitas, I just discovered. And they reach millions of followers on social media. I'm sure there's many Russian bots there and Musk bots following them. But these guys are all framing the battle with what they call the quote-unquote left, and even their battle with middle-of-the-road Democrats as a kind of holy war. And they're calling the left a secular religion that needs to be annihilated or obliterated, that they can't even, have any communications anymore. And Posobiec in his book calls leftists and even liberal Democrats unhumans. They don't need to be treated like real human beings. And he praises Pinochet's helicopter killings in that book. And that was where Pinochet just took dissidents, people he didn't like, up into helicopters, then threw them out and killed them. And unfortunately, Posobiec in this book said that that's a good plan for America. And both J.D. Vance and Donald Trump burbed this book, with Vance calling it a good plan for America. So that's kind of where they're heading, unfortunately, in a pretty quick pace. And, they're doing that also as, the economy comes apart. And I've talked in a lot of my Substack newsletters about how there really seems to be an intentional plan to destroy the American economy and ruin the middle class, and that's kind of what the tariffs are doing, and so on, as a way for centralizing oligarchic control, much the way Naomi Klein wrote about it in her book Shock Doctrine. That's really a lot of people on the liberal columnists are like, why are they doing this? This is crazy. Trump's just out of his mind. But actually, it all makes sense. Like, these totally irrational tariffs make it impossible for non-billionaires and non-huge corporations to navigate, and a lot of them just lose their businesses or close. And we're already seeing the bankruptcy of a lot of farmers. And that'll allow for private equity and investment firms to buy up those bankrupt farms and consolidate ownership over the nation's food supply, which is pretty terrible. And sadly, those farmers in places like Nebraska and Alabama all voted for Trump, so they've kind of brought this on themselves. And what can you say? I mean, once again, the right wing, as I've discussed also in my work, has really learned framing, and now they've taken over a lot of the media in a way that's it's hard to figure out how to deal with that. So it's hard for me to understand the right's rage against the secular left or whatever. And I mean, basically, sure. I mean, identity politics was kind of an overreach and so on. I didn't like woke, cancellation culture and so on. But it seems like the pendulum has swung kind of too far in the other direction. And somebody like Walsh or whatever, they have such a deep hatred of any focus on climate change or global warming. But this already affects all of us. I mean, it's super warm in New York right now, and We're seeing more floods, all these impacts of climate change, more droughts and so on. So obviously these guys are funded by, the Heritage Foundation or all the arms of Koch and Peter Thiel and, the Koch brothers and so on. And, they're also, they're for whatever reason, they are, rigidly holding the line that climate change is a hoax and ignoring all the science on it. And it's very depressing. And they're sort of banging their chests all the time with these videos that get so many views. But if you really look at these people like Walsh and so on, I would say they've locked themselves into these rigid mental prisons, and they've thrown away the keys, and they're strutting around in these cages. They're beating their chests. They're thinking they're masters of the universe when they're really like trained monkeys. They're bought and sold tools of the oligarchs who are also, trying to amass private wealth by lying to the people. And, maybe some of them believe it, and they're funded by the right wing, and they're all using this sort of Christian fundamentalism, Christian fanaticism to keep the masses of the people indoctrinated to such an extreme degree that they'll actually support, the sort of oligarchic, technocratic, fascistic control over all facets of U.S. society. Even as this techno-fascist thing destroys their own capacity to survive, as we're now seeing with these farmers across the U.S. So I feel when you hear somebody like Kilmiad, how you pronounce his name, make this kind of slip of the tongue about the homeless people, I always feel that maybe it's not accidental, maybe I'm just being paranoid, but I feel like the right is constantly putting out these trial balloons to see how far they can take things, how far they can push the envelope of discourse further to the right. And their goal is to keep these kind of masses or kind of hypnotized and entranced by this media toward deeper levels of authoritarian mind control and the normalization of things like ethnic cleansing, mass incarceration camps, deportations, genocide. And as of this moment, I can't identify a strong enough countervailing power in American society able to stop this. Although there are other forces at play, and I think we do need to acknowledge those and explore those and sort of support those. So yeah, I'm very concerned about this sort of fury and, in a sense, this underlying bloodlust on the right. And I know they keep repeating that's the left to blame, that the left is the violent and oppressive side. But, that's also, they're bullshitting, right? Like the Trump regime just pulled a report that was, put out by the Department of Justice last year called, What the National Institute of Justice Research Tells Us About Domestic Terrorism. And that report exposes what we all know, which has also been just confirmed by more shootings this week. The vast majority of domestic terrorism is caused by right-wing extremists, mostly white Christian men. The right's constant attack against the left, or what they're meaninglessly calling Antifa, there's no organization called Antifa, this is just made up. This is an essential part of the right's strategy, and it's something that has been defined as DARVO. DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. Jim Stewartson writes about this very well in Mind War, his extremely important newsletter. And we all should educate ourselves about these tactics, share the knowledge with them, so that we get more media literacy around the types of tactics they're using and why they're so hard to sort of counteract. So we know the US has around 900 billionaires, according to Forbes' most recent list. And at least 70% of those billionaires, I imagine it's actually more, the billionaire families are backing Republican right-wing candidates, according to estimates, because those right-wing policies benefit them in the short term. So the right wing has financial support from a huge majority of the country's billionaires. They've had these vast sums over many decades to develop rhetorical and persuasive techniques, and also these sophisticated psyops like QAnon, where at the same time they've also learned to co-opt and imitate all of the media strategies that used to really work well for progressive media. So for instance, somebody like Walsh has sort of slick, punk rocky kind of graphics, or slacker rock graphics. And these were once kind of the hallmarks of progressive liberal media. And stand-up comedians used to support a left-wing progressive ideology for the most part. Today we have this sort of Rogan spear with a vast number of right-wing ideologues and operatives who are constantly attacking like LGBT and trans rights and so on. So the right has figured out how to burrow into and kind of assimilate and imitate every cultural and media sphere, while the other side is very much in retreat. And the right still strangely pretends they're the underdogs, even though they're now controlling all three branches of the federal government, and they've consolidated so much of the media landscape. Right-wing media now dwarfs kind of liberal, or maybe we want to say like neutral media. I never found CNN or CNBC or any of those things MSNBC very left, let's say. And this is going to get much worse because you have the Trump and Musk ally Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle, buying Paramount, which owns CBS, among other properties, and he's going to give all of that a right-wing spin. Ellison may also become the majority stakeholder of TikTok in the US, which will then be under the algorithmic control of the right, as Twitter is now under Musk's control. I can't open Twitter without seeing all this right-wing stuff, even though I don't subscribe to Musk or any of these people. So this ongoing media consolidation is extremely important and far more ominous than, let's say, the token reinstatement of Jimmy Kimmel due to public pressure. Although it is important, and it's one of the levers that the public has, is economic boycotts. And so it's important that that did happen. But Fox News has had a tremendously destructive impact over the last 30 years, partly to the government permitting monopoly consolidation of local media. And if you go back to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which sadly was passed by neoliberal Clinton, it permitted media companies like Fox to own a number of local TV and radio stations in the same city. That wasn't allowed before. And Fox used this change in the law to buy clusters of stations in major markets, and then it had more stations under its control. It could run the same shows across all of them, maximize ad revenue, and it put smaller independent stations out of business. And this led to more consolidation as they folded, and Fox became the default in many cities, and then it learned how to kind of exacerbate, kind of its hold on people through fear and so on. I mean, Fox has poisoned the minds of many millions of people here in the U.S., and it's really contributed to the sort of really depressing degradation of social discourse that made a Trump possible, or maybe even inevitable now when we look back. And we know that many Americans, as they get older, they become more passive, they become bored, they're sitting in their homes with maybe, stale relationships or marriages. They don't have community, they don't have much connection, and so they're absorbing whatever entertains them or just holds their attention for a moment on the television. So Fox, kind of learned how to keep stimulating the amygdala, so these kind of entranced viewers keep themselves in a state of fear, frustration, and anger. And that state in itself, like any state, can become an addictive state. And so we all know also the problem with algorithmic capture via Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and so on. So I'm not going to get into that again here. And the problem is that, like any addiction, you need bigger hits to maintain yourself in a stable state over time. So Trump developed a reality TV show style of politics, and he has to constantly up the ante as in a TV show, and provide sort of crazier stunts and more debased spectacles, such as his recent racist attacks on Democratic leaders using AI slop, really a new level of degradation, which everybody kind of noticed. The media critic Neil Gabler wrote a great series of essays about how Trump is doing this, and Gabler has noted that Trump makes, quote, entertainment, not governance, the very purpose of government. Or, to put it another way, he reconceived government from its traditional role as a system to guide the nation into a highly untraditional one as a vehicle for his performance, which is just as reductive and terrible as it sounds. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a stroke of perverse genius, as well as the basis for so many of his other perversities. Suddenly, government wasn't boring anymore, and this seemed to tickle his supporters. Suddenly, government commanded our attention. So that's kind of what, Trump's sort of unique brand of, sociopathic narcissism and his reality TV show kind of manner, have created this circumstance. What's very concerning about it, particularly as Trump is going into a more and more sort of cognitive decline without any capacity for empathy, fixated on vengeance and seeking to constantly increase his own wealth and power, what's going to be the limit on this person? There's a very real danger that as Trump continues to lose his grip, He might even intensify global conflicts, as entertainment. Could be a standoff with Putin, for instance, who's another sociopath, until ultimately we're reaching a kind of zero-sum game where nuclear conflict, nuclear war becomes in the cards and maybe even inevitable. Because we're in a situation where this Trumpist political ideology demands endless emergencies. Their brand is crisis. And these have to become more and more dire to turn the focus of political attention back on him and keep everybody from noticing the economic breakdown that's happening. And we're seeing already these consequences are going to have a lot of consequences, maybe irreversible consequences, not only just for democracy, but for human beings and the planet as a whole. One person who's been doing a good job raising the alarm about the situation is Lawrence O'Donnell at MSNBC. So, for instance, after Trump's really rambling, barely coherent address to the U.S. military, O'Donnell noted that the emergency we face is not the government shutdown, which is already happening, but actually it's something much, much worse than that. And I thought I would just, read one of his quotes from his presentation. The emergency that the United States of America is facing tonight is an emergency the United States of America has created for the world. And that emergency is that the President of the United States, in his public appearance today, proved that he is mentally incapable and emotionally incapable of fulfilling his constitutional duties as President of the United States. In other words, there is no President of the United States as we knew it. There is no functioning intelligence, no functioning judgment mechanism within the mind of the current holder of the title. And that person is also the holder of the nuclear codes that could destroy the planet in seconds. And he is, much to the horror of the commanding officers of the American military, who had to listen to him today, the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military in the history of the world. That's what O'Donnell had to say. So we can see that the political leadership, the people around Trump on the right, are playing a very, very dangerous game at the moment. It's like they're waiting for Trump to become such a liability or do something so overtly insane, or just finally become mentally incapacitated so they can get rid of him and install 40-year-old J.D. Vance into that role. And that's maybe even more concerning because Vance is a more sophisticated intellect than Trump for sure, but he also obviously has severe liabilities, particularly a very negative charisma. People just do not like Vance. And that was almost certainly going to break up the MAGA cult. And they may, the best case scenario is they begin to realize that the sort of oligarchic control that's imposed is what's actually going down. But when Trump collapses and gets ousted, or whatever, maybe 3-6 months, who knows, Vance is going to inherit all of those unleashed powers of the executive branch, the ability to attack U.S. citizens, destroying the Constitution, manipulating the elections. And so we're likely to have an autocratic government controlled from behind the scenes by Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, with Vance as the front man for a technocratic control system that really seeks to establish a two-tier society like the Morlocks and the Elwys in War of the Worlds, where you have a small group of oligarchic rulers and their henchmen with a vast multitude of the dispossessed. So that's why this attack on the middle class and what Musk did with X, with Twitter, where he was able to fire so many of the employees and still make it function, with AI and so on. That's what they're kind of looking at here. It's very interesting. I mean, the question is it going to work? What are people going to do? It could still go in a lot of different directions. That's why I'm bothering to make this type of piece. So a lot of what's happening now needs to be understood in terms of a longer term strategy developed by Heritage and supported by people like Thiel and Musk and Andreessen to lock up permanent power and control of the US. And we would also be very naive to think that that actually is impossible here. We've seen it happen in North Korea and Russia and so on, even though there are certain structural elements of American society that work against it. For instance, it's a very big country, it has a huge amount of wealth, and it has a very diverse economy, unlike Russia. But we need to wake up right now and realize that in many ways what's happening is a worst case scenario for human freedom, constitutional protections, the rule of law, the Earth's ecology, which we don't even talk about anymore, and also a decent future for our children in a rapidly changing world. Ken Klippenstein has reported on Trump's recent memorandum, NSPM 7, which is titled Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence. So this directs the DOJ, the DHS, the FBI, and others to investigate, disrupt, and prosecute domestic terrorist organizations, quote unquote. So Klippenstein's article is very important. I definitely recommend subscribing to him, and I'm going to quote it at length. In NSPM 7, Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence, President Trump directs the Justice Department, the FBI, and other national security agencies and departments to fight his version of political violence in America, retooling a network of joint terrorism task forces to focus on leftist political violence in America. So this is a vast counterterrorism army made up of federal, state, and local agents would, as Trump aide Stephen Miller said, form, quote, the central hub of that effort. So, yeah, NSPM 7 directs a new national strategy to disrupt any individual or groups, quote, that foment political violence, unquote, including, quote, before they result in violent political acts, unquote. So as Klippenstein acknowledges, this means they're targeting pre-crime, as in the film Minority Report. He goes on to write, the Trump administration isn't only targeting organizations or groups, but even individuals and entities whom NSPM 7 says can be identified by any of the following indicators of violence or propensity of violence. So get ready for this list if you haven't heard already. Anti-Americanism, whatever that means. Anti-capitalism. And we do have to remember, this is a whole, our country constitutionally is founded on freedom of speech, freedom to dissent, freedom to have alternative views, and it's that ferment which has made America great and powerful in a way. Anti-Christianity, I mean, that's just, separation of church and state is basic to the Constitution. Support for the overthrow of the United States government. Extremism on migration, which means, I guess, not agreeing that we should be able to just toss out people who are here without due process or hearing or anything, just whatever. Extremism on race, extremism on gender, hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on religion, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on morality, whatever that is. What is that morality in a country that was founded on the genocide of indigenous people and slavery and so on? It's quite what are those traditional views? So the United States requires a national strategy to investigate and disrupt networks, entities, and organizations that foment political violence so that law enforcement can intervene in criminal conspiracies before they result in violent political acts. That's what the report says. So this is like Klippenstein, it's a pre-crime kind of idea to prevent attacks before they happen. So this means monitoring political activity or speech as an investigative method to discover radicalism. And this is, we have to understand, this is like a long-term strategy that they've worked out and gamed out. We have, Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, Russell Vogt, Peter Thiel, and their cronies. They've taken the time to work out a long-term plan, and they're really seeking kind of full spectrum dominance over the US, including the same level of control over the psychological and ideological mind space of this country that you find in ruthless autocratic regimes like North Korea and Russia. So, the Christian far right and the tech-focused nerd-reich, or the tech billionaires and so on, they seem to wear, they wear business suits, J.Crew t-shirts, hoodies. They speak in American accents. They look normal, but underlying that, they have a ruthless agenda and an ideology that's really as extreme as the Taliban or North Korea or any other fanatic, religious ideology that seeks control over a large population. So, as I've also written before, one of the positives of this current situation is that it is very clarifying. We can see that the currents of white supremacy, Nazism, and the kind of crusader Christianity that led to the genocide and enslavement of many millions of indigenous people around the world, it never ended. It's now resurfaced in its most active and virulent form. The poet Aimé Césaire noted that Nazism in the 40s was a kind of internal recolonization, when the tools that have been used to exploit and kind of like dominate the despised other, concentration camps and all this kind of stuff, get turned back against their own people at their place of origin. So with massed ICE agents attacking immigrants and, you know, attacking Chicago housing complexes, you know, we're now fully in that situation. But there are a lot of reasons to think that the plan may fail. However, it's not going to simply fail on its own. We're going to need people here to awaken to what's happening and then find new ways to work together to, you know, subvert it, overcome it, and so ultimately we need a kind of purple revolution where everybody who's been betrayed by the government over many decades, you know, red and blue, people who don't have health insurance, people who've seen their, you know, their profits siphoned up to the top 0.1%. We're going to have to work together to construct something new and better in its place. But to do that, it's going to require breaking the oligarchic concentration of wealth, which is definitely not going to be easy. And, you know, once again, a lot of people don't even know what's happening. I agree with the analysis of AOC and others that this extreme overreach of the authoritarian power is actually a sign of weakness instead of strength. If we can think of this authoritarian thing as a kind of creature, we can see that this entity is really terrified of losing control over the situation and is unleashed, so it has to keep doubling down. And it may be that it has set in motion forces that will lead inevitably to its own collapse. Historically, we can see the fascist impulse as related to Thanatos, the Freudian death drive. I mean, Trump and his cronies, their efforts to ruin, you know, truth and evidence-based reality and ruin our basic sanity for purposes of their power and control, are maybe also seeking out the countervailing force or energy that can finally stop this thing, stop them. And fascist regimes often end in really mass destruction. They often end with the demise of those who launched that enterprise. So, you know, we don't necessarily need to get to that point, but it is sort of tending in that direction. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there for now, and we'll talk more in a later video.